The Sheikh billionaire cursed the timid waitress in Arabic. Her flawless reply shattered his ego in front of everyone. Crystal chandeliers of Zuma, Miami, cast a warm amber glow across the sleek marble floors as Layla Hassan moved between tables with practiced invisibility. At 26, she had perfected the art of being overlooked. Her Columbia University linguistics degree and fluency in 7 languages hidden beneath a simple black uniform and downcast eyes. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she spoke only when necessary, always in soft, apologetic tones that made wealthy diners forget her presence the moment she stepped away from their tables. It was a Thursday evening in South Beach, and the restaurant hummed with the usual crowd of tech entrepreneurs, real estate moguls, and celebrities who treated $100 appetizers as casual snacks. Layla refilled water glasses, cleared plates, and smiled politely at jokes she pretended not to understand in 3 different languages. This was her life now, so different from the academic halls of Columbia, where she had once debated linguistic theory with professors who called her brilliant. That was before Marcus. Before the betrayal, before everything fell apart, she pushed the memories away as she always did, focusing instead on the rhythm of her work. Table 12 needed more wine. Table 7 was ready for dessert menus. Table 4 had been waiting too long for their check. She moved efficiently, her mind cataloguing tasks while her heart remained carefully numb. Then the atmosphere in the restaurant changed. Layla felt it before she saw it. Conversations dropped to whispers. The maitre d' straightened his tie and rushed toward the entrance. Even the executive chef emerged from the kitchen, smoothing his white coat. She glanced toward the door and understood immediately. Sheikh Rashid Al Mansour had arrived. He moved through the restaurant like a force of nature, his presence commanding attention without effort. At 48, he was tall and imposing, with sharp features, a perfectly trimmed beard touched with silver, and eyes that seemed to calculate the worth of everything they landed on. His custom-tailored Armani suit probably cost more than Layla made in a year. 2 assistants flanked him, both speaking rapidly into phones, while 3 security personnel maintained a discreet but unmistakable perimeter. Layla had heard the other servers talk about him. Sheikh Rashid Al Mansour, petroleum magnate, owner of Al Mansour Energy Corporation, worth an estimated $3.7 billion. He owned hotels in Dubai, real estate in London, and had just closed a deal for a private island in the Maldives. He was known for his business acumen, his ruthless negotiations, and his complete intolerance for incompetence. He was also known for his arrogance. The maitre d' personally escorted him to the best table in the house, a corner booth with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Miami skyline. The assistants sat at an adjacent table, still working their phones. The security team positioned themselves strategically throughout the dining room. Layla watched from a distance, relieved that she wouldn't be serving him. That honor went to Marcus, no relation to her ex, the restaurant's most experienced server who specialized in high-profile clients. She turned back to her own section, grateful for the anonymity, but fate, it seemed, had other plans. 10 minutes later, the restaurant manager appeared at her elbow, his face tight with stress. "Layla, I need you to take over table 1. Marcus just got called away for a family emergency." Her stomach dropped. "Table 1. But that's Sheikh Al Mansour, yes. He's already ordered. But you'll need to bring out the courses and attend to anything he needs. Can you handle it?" It wasn't really a question. Layla nodded, her mouth suddenly dry. She smoothed her uniform, took a deep breath, and approached the corner booth with a water pitcher and fresh glasses. "Good evening," she said softly in English, her eyes fixed on the table as she began pouring water. "I'll be taking care of you this evening. Your appetizers will be out shortly." Sheikh Rashid didn't acknowledge her. He was reading something on his phone, his expression one of intense concentration. One of his assistants was explaining something about oil futures. Layla finished pouring and turned to leave. That's when it happened. Her sleeve caught the edge of the water pitcher. It tilted, and though she caught it quickly, a few drops of water splashed onto the table, landing inches from the Sheikh's phone. Time seemed to freeze. Sheikh Rashid looked up slowly, his dark eyes moving from the water droplets to Layla's horrified face. His expression transformed from concentration to cold fury in an instant. Then he began to speak, and the words that came out were in Arabic. Harsh, cutting Arabic that sliced through the air like a blade. "Incompetent fool," he said, his voice low but dripping with contempt. "How do they let someone so clumsy and stupid work in a place like this? Look at her. She can barely hold a pitcher without making a mess. Probably never had a proper education, probably doesn't have a brain in her head. These people, they're only good for cleaning floors, and even that they do poorly," he continued, his words growing more vicious. "She stands there like a frightened mouse, too dumb to even apologize properly. This is what happens when restaurants hire based on pity instead of competence. Look at her face, she doesn't even understand what I'm saying. Ignorant and useless." The restaurant had gone completely silent. Other diners watched with uncomfortable expressions, not understanding the Arabic, but recognizing the tone. The assistants looked down at their phones, embarrassed. The manager started to approach, unsure how to handle the situation. Layla stood frozen, the pitcher trembling slightly in her hands. She felt the familiar sting of tears behind her eyes, the same helpless humiliation she'd felt when Marcus had destroyed her career, when professors had turned their backs on her, when doors had closed one after another until she'd ended up here, invisible and voiceless. But something inside her snapped. Maybe it was the injustice of being insulted in her own language by someone who assumed she was too ignorant to understand. Maybe it was years of swallowing her pride and hiding her intelligence. Maybe it was the memory of who she used to be before the world had beaten her down. Whatever it was, Layla lifted her chin and looked Sheikh Rashid Al-Mansour directly in the eyes. Then she spoke, and the words came out in flawless Arabic, with the precise dialect of the Emirates. Every syllable perfectly pronounced. "With all due respect, Sheikh Al-Mansour," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The poet Al-Mutanabi once wrote, "The nobility of a man is not found in his wealth or his lineage, but in how he treats those who can offer him nothing in return. I apologize sincerely for the water, which I will clean immediately, but I will not apologize for my dignity, which is not for sale at any price, not even to a man who measures his worth in billions, but cannot measure his words with basic human decency." She paused, holding his shocked gaze, then continued with devastating precision. "You called me ignorant, yet you quote no poetry. You called me stupid, yet you assume that language is a barrier only for the poor. You called me useless, yet here I stand, fluent in 7 languages, including yours, with a degree from Columbia University in linguistics, while you sit there having revealed that your education, however expensive, failed to teach you the most basic lesson, that cruelty to those you perceive as beneath you reveals not their weakness, but your own." The silence in the restaurant was absolute. Sheikh Rashid's mouth had fallen open. His eyes were wide with shock, his face frozen in an expression of complete disbelief. One of his assistants had actually dropped his phone. The other diners were staring openly now, some with their hands over their mouths, others leaning forward to hear better. Layla set down the water pitcher with a steady hand, pulled a cloth from her apron, and calmly wiped the few drops of water from the table. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't waver. "Your appetizers will be out in 3 minutes," she said, switching back to English. "If you require anything else, please don't hesitate to ask." She turned and walked away with her head high, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. She made it to the server station before her knees began to shake. She gripped the counter, taking deep breaths, waiting for the manager to appear and fire her on the spot. But when she finally looked back at table 1, she saw something she didn't expect. Sheikh Rashid Al-Mansour was still staring at the spot where she'd been standing, his expression no longer angry but utterly stunned. He looked like a man who had just watched the sun rise in the west, like someone whose entire understanding of the world had just been turned upside down. And for the first time in 3 years, since the day Marcus had stolen her research and destroyed her future, Layla Hassan felt something she'd almost forgotten. She felt powerful. The kitchen doors swung open and the appetizers were ready. Layla picked up the tray, steadied herself, and walked back toward table 1. Whatever happened next, she had already won something far more valuable than this job. She had won back her voice. The sheikh watched her approach, and this time when their eyes met, there was no contempt in his gaze. There was something else entirely, something that looked almost like respect, mixed with a fascination that would change both of their lives forever. But neither of them knew that yet. For now, there was only the moment, the silence, and the undeniable Truth that had just been spoken in a language the arrogant billionaire had thought would keep his cruelty secret. He had been wrong, and Layla Hassan was just getting started. Layla placed the appetizers on the table with steady hands, her professional mask firmly back in place. Hamachi sashimi with jalapeno for the Sheikh, edamame dumplings for his assistants at the adjacent table. She worked efficiently, her movements precise, as if the last 5 minutes hadn't just shattered the entire dynamic of the room. Sheikh Rashid watched her every move. His shock had transformed into something more complex, an expression that mixed embarrassment, curiosity, and something that might have been admiration. When she finished arranging the plates, he cleared his throat. "Wait," he said, this time in English. Layla paused, her eyes meeting his with a directness that was new, that felt like armor she'd just remembered she owned. "Yes, sir?" He seemed to struggle with what to say next. His assistants were watching nervously, clearly unsure whether they should intervene. The restaurant around them had returned to a low hum of conversation, but Layla could feel dozens of eyes still glancing their way. "You're Arabic," he finally said, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier arrogance. "Where did you learn it?" "Columbia University," Layla replied calmly. "I specialized in Semitic languages, with a focus on modern dialectical variations across the Arabian Peninsula. I wrote my master's thesis on the evolution of Emirati Arabic in the context of rapid globalization." She watched his eyebrows rise incrementally with each word. "I also speak French, Spanish, Farsi, Turkish, and Hebrew," she continued, her tone matter-of-fact. "The Hebrew is conversational rather than fluent, but I can read classical texts. Would you like me to recite the rest of the Al-Mutanabbi poem I quoted, or shall I bring out your main course?" For a moment, Sheikh Rashid simply stared at her. Then, incredibly, the corner of his mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was something. "The main course," he said. "But I would like to hear the rest of the poem, later." Layla nodded once and walked away, feeling his eyes follow her across the restaurant. In the kitchen, she leaned against the stainless steel counter, her heart still racing. The head chef, Carlos, looked at her with wide eyes. "Did you just quote poetry at Sheikh Al-Mansour?" He asked in Spanish. "Yes," Layla replied in the same language. "In Arabic." "Yes," Carlos let out a low whistle. "You're either getting fired or getting the biggest tip of your life. Possibly both." Layla managed a small smile. "Probably fired." But as the evening progressed, something strange happened. Sheikh Rashid didn't complain. He didn't ask for a different server. He didn't storm out or demand to speak to the manager. Instead, he ate his meal slowly, thoughtfully, and every time Layla approached the table, he watched her with that same intense, analytical gaze. When she brought the main course, Wagyu beef with truffle butter, he spoke again. "Columbia University," he said. "That's an impressive institution. What brought you from there to here?" It was a personal question, inappropriate from a customer. Layla should have deflected it with a polite non-answer, but something about the way he asked it, without the earlier condescension, without judgment, made her pause. "Life," she said simply. "It doesn't always go according to plan." "No," he agreed, cutting into his steak. "It doesn't." He took a bite, chewed thoughtfully, then looked up at her again. "The dialect you used, it wasn't just Arabic. It was specifically Emirati, with the formal register used in educated discourse. Most foreigners who learn Arabic learn Egyptian or Levantine. Why Emirati?" Despite herself, Layla felt a flicker of the old excitement she used to feel when discussing linguistics. Because it's underrepresented in academic literature, despite being increasingly important in global business contexts. The UAE has become a major international hub, but most translation services still rely on standardized modern Standard Arabic, which doesn't capture the nuances of how business is actually conducted in Dubai or Abu Dhabi. Sheikh Rashid set down his fork, giving her his complete attention. "Go on. The incorporation of English loanwords, the influence of the large expatriate population, the way traditional Bedouin expressions coexist with modern, technological terminology. It creates a unique linguistic landscape that's fascinating from both a sociolinguistic and a practical standpoint." She stopped abruptly, realizing she'd been lecturing him like he was one of her old professors. "I apologize. You didn't ask for a dissertation with your dinner." "Actually," he said slowly, "that's exactly what I asked for. You said you wrote your thesis on this. My master's thesis, yes. And your doctorate? The question hit like a physical blow. Layla's expression shuttered immediately, the warmth draining from her face. I didn't complete my doctorate. Why not? That's not an appropriate question, sir. Would you like dessert? Sheikh Rashid studied her for a long moment, and Layla had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see far more than she wanted to reveal. But he didn't push. Yes, he said finally, the chocolate soufflé. And bring one for yourself. I'm working, sir, I'm aware. I'm also a customer making a request. Bring 2 soufflés and sit down for 5 minutes. Consider it compensation for my earlier rudeness. Layla hesitated. Every professional instinct told her to refuse, but there was something in his expression, a genuine contrition mixed with curiosity, that made her nod. 5 minutes, she agreed. 20 minutes later, Layla found herself sitting across from one of the richest men in the world, eating chocolate soufflé and discussing the finer points of Arabic poetry. The manager had walked by twice, looking confused but not intervening. The other diners had stopped staring, though she could still feel occasional glances. Al-Mutanabi is often misunderstood in the West, Sheikh Rashid was saying, his earlier arrogance completely absent. They translate his words but miss the context, the pride of a man who rose from nothing to become the greatest poet of his age. From nothing is relative, Layla countered. He had education, opportunity, and most importantly, he had patrons who recognized his talent. Not everyone is so fortunate. You sound bitter. I sound realistic. Sheikh Rashid leaned back, studying her. You're not what I expected. You mean I'm not the ignorant, clumsy fool you assumed I was? He had the grace to look ashamed. I apologize for those words. They were beneath me, and more importantly, they were untrue. I made assumptions based on your position, and I was wrong. It was a real apology, delivered without excuses. Layla felt some of her anger soften, though her guard remained up. Apology accepted, she said. But understanding why you made those assumptions might be more valuable than the apology itself. You're right, he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I was raised in a world where position and education were visible, where worth was measured in titles and degrees displayed on walls. I forgot that circumstances can hide capability, that a uniform doesn't define intelligence, and that cruelty in a language you think is secret is still cruelty. Yes, that most of all. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the earlier confrontation settling between them in a new way, not as anger but as understanding. Why are you here? Sheikh Rashid asked suddenly. So a woman with your education, your abilities, you should be teaching, researching, working in international relations or translation services. Why are you serving tables in Miami? Layla's jaw tightened. Because sometimes the world doesn't care about your abilities. Sometimes it cares more about who you know, who believes you, and who has the power to destroy you when you threaten their success. The bitterness in her voice was sharp enough to cut. Sheikh Rashid's eyes narrowed. Someone took something from you, it wasn't a question. Layla stood abruptly, the 5 minutes long past. Your check will be ready whenever you are, Sheikh Al-Mansour. Thank you for the soufflé. She walked away before he could respond, before the tears that were threatening could actually fall. She'd said too much, revealed too much. This was why she kept her head down, why she stayed invisible. The moment you let people see you, they could hurt you. She'd learned that lesson the hard way, but as she processed his payment 20 minutes later, she found something unexpected tucked into the leather check holder. Along with his black American Express card was a business card, heavy stock with embossed gold lettering. Sheikh Rashid Al-Mansour, CEO, Al-Mansour Energy Corporation. And on the back, written in elegant Arabic script, was a phone number and a single sentence. If you ever want to tell me who hurt you, I'm an excellent listener. Can I have resources that might interest you? Layla stared at the card for a long moment. Then she slipped it into her pocket, processed his payment, and returned the check holder with his card and receipt. The tip line showed a number that made her breath catch. $10,000, but it was the note written below it that made her hands shake. Not charity, not pity. Payment for the most valuable lesson I've learned in years, that wisdom and worth have nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with character. You have both. Thank you for reminding me that I need to earn mine. When Layla looked up, Sheikh Rashid was standing by the door, his assistants and security team already outside. He met her eyes across the restaurant, nodded once with something that looked like respect, and walked out into the Miami night. Layla stood there holding the check holder, her mind racing, her heart pounding, and for the first time in 3 years, she felt something dangerous blooming in her chest. Hope she didn't know it yet, but that single evening had set in motion a chain of events that would change everything. The sheikh who had insulted her in Arabic would become her greatest ally. The past that had destroyed her would finally face justice, and the voice she'd reclaimed tonight would become the weapon that would bring down the man who'd tried to silence her forever. But first, she had to decide whether to make the call. The business card felt heavy in her pocket, like a key to a door she'd thought was locked forever. Outside, Sheikh Rashid Al-Mansour sat in the back of his Rolls-Royce, staring at his phone but not seeing it. His mind was replaying the evening, the shock of hearing perfect Arabic from the woman he'd dismissed, the intelligence blazing in her eyes, the poetry she'd wielded like a sword. He'd built an empire by recognizing value where others saw nothing. He'd made billions by investing in potential that others overlooked, and tonight, he'd almost missed the most valuable thing he'd encountered in years. A woman who could quote Al-Mutanabi from memory, who spoke 7 languages, who had a Columbia degree, and worked as a waitress for reasons that clearly involved pain and injustice, a mystery, a challenge, and if he was honest with himself, something more. "Back to the hotel, sir?" his driver asked. Sheikh Rashid looked at the restaurant one more time, at the warm light spilling onto the Miami street, and made a decision. "No," he said. "We're staying in Miami for a while longer. Clear my schedule for the next week. I have some research to do." "Research, sir?" "Yes, into a very interesting puzzle," he smiled. And it was the first genuine smile he'd worn in months. Inside the restaurant, Layla Hassan finished her shift, changed out of her uniform, and walked out into the warm Miami night with a business card in her pocket and a decision to make. Behind her, the restaurant lights dimmed. Ahead of her, the future waited, uncertain and terrifying and full of possibility. She took a deep breath, pulled out her phone, and stared at the business card for a long moment. Then she saved the number, not to call tonight. Maybe not tomorrow, but someday, because sometimes the universe gives you a second chance. And Layla Hassan had just decided she was brave enough to take it. 3 days passed before Layla saw Sheikh Rashid again. 3 days during which she worked her shifts, visited her father in the hospital, and stared at that business card every night before bed. 3 days of telling herself that calling him would be foolish, that men like him didn't really care about people like her, that the $10,000 tip was just guilt money from someone who could afford to throw cash at his mistakes. 3 days of almost believing her own arguments. On the 4th day he came back. Layla was refilling the wine glasses at table 7 when she felt that same shift in the restaurant's atmosphere. She looked up, and there he was, walking through the entrance with the same commanding presence, but this time without the entourage. No assistants, no security team, just Sheikh Rashid Al-Mansour in an impeccably tailored navy suit, scanning the dining room until his eyes found her. He smiled. Layla's heart did something complicated in her chest. She finished pouring the wine with hands that were suddenly unsteady, excused herself from the table, and watched as the maitre d' escorted him to a table in her section. Of course it was in her section. She took a moment to compose herself, smoothing her uniform and steadying her breathing, before approaching his table. "Good evening." "Sheikh Al-Mansour," she said, her voice professionally neutral. "Welcome back to Zuma." "Good evening, Layla." He used her name like he'd been practicing it. "I was hoping you'd be working tonight." "Were you?" "I was. I have a proposition for you." Layla raised an eyebrow. "I'm not interested in propositions, sir, but I can offer you our specials for the evening." His smile widened. "Fair enough. Then let me rephrase. I have a business opportunity that I'd like to discuss with you. Over dinner, if you're willing. Not here. Not while you're working. Somewhere we can talk properly." "I don't think that's appropriate." "Why not?" "Because you're a customer and I'm a server. Because you're a billionaire and I'm—" She stopped herself. "You're what?" "A Columbia-educated linguist who speaks 7 languages. A woman who can quote classical Arabic poetry from memory. Someone who clearly has a story that involves injustice and talent being wasted." His voice was gentle but firm. "Layla, I didn't come back here for the hamachi, excellent though it is. I came back because I can't stop thinking about what you said, about who you might be beneath that uniform, and about who hurt you badly enough to put you here. Layla felt her defenses rising. You don't know anything about me. I know. That's why I want to have dinner. To learn, and if I say no, then I'll order the omakase. Eat quietly, leave another generous tip and come back tomorrow to ask again. And the day after that. And the day after that. I'm a very persistent man, Layla. It's how I built my company. Despite herself, Layla felt a smile tugging at her lips. That sounds like harassment, Sheikh Al-Mansour. Rashid, please, and you're right, it does. So let me try a different approach. He leaned forward, his expression becoming serious. I made a terrible first impression. I was cruel and arrogant, and I judged you based on assumptions that were not only wrong but offensive. You had every right to walk away and never speak to me again. But you didn't just walk away. You stood your ground, you educated me, and you did it with more grace than I deserved. He paused, holding her gaze. I've spent 3 days thinking about that. About you. About the fact that someone with your intelligence and education is working here, which means something went very wrong somewhere. And I've spent 3 days wanting to know what happened, because I have resources, Layla. Significant resources. And I have a habit of fixing problems, especially when those problems involve talented people being held back by circumstances or by people who wronged them. Layla's breath caught. Why would you do that? You don't know me, because I recognize potential when I see it, because I built my fortune by investing in things others overlook, and because, he hesitated, then continued with surprising honesty, because you reminded me of something I'd forgotten. That wealth and power mean nothing if you use them to diminish others instead of elevating them. You gave me a gift that night, even if it didn't feel like one. Let me return it. The restaurant hummed around them, but Layla felt like they were in a bubble separate from everything else. She studied his face, looking for deception, for ulterior motives, for the catch that had to be there. But all she saw was sincerity. One dinner, she heard herself say. To talk, nothing more. Rashid's smile was genuine and warm. One dinner, nothing more. When is your next day off? Sunday. Perfect. I'll send a car for you at 7. Where should I? No car, Layla interrupted. I'll meet you somewhere public. You choose the restaurant, text me the address. She pulled out her phone. I assume you still have my number from the employee contact list. You definitely didn't ask the manager for. He had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. I may have made some inquiries. Stalker behavior, Sheikh Al-Mansour, Rashid. And yes, probably. But effective stalker behavior. This time Layla did smile, a real one that felt strange on her face after so long. Fine, Rashid. Text me the details. Now, would you actually like to order dinner, or was this entire visit just to ask me out? Can't it be both? It can, but you're still going to tip the standard 20% this time. That $10,000 was excessive. It was appropriate for the value of what I received. It was guilt money. It was recognition money. There's a difference. They looked at each other for a long moment, and Layla felt something shift between them. Something that felt dangerous and exciting and terrifying all at once. I'll bring you a menu, she said finally, breaking the moment. Thank you. Layla. She walked away, feeling his eyes on her back, her mind racing. What was she doing? This was insane. He was a billionaire sheikh from the UAE, and she was a waitress with a destroyed academic career and a dying father. They existed in completely different worlds, but he'd come back. He'd asked to know her story. He'd offered help without even knowing what she needed. And for the first time in 3 years, someone was looking at her and seeing not a waitress, not a failure, not a victim, but a person worth knowing. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. Rashid ordered the omakase and ate slowly, watching Layla move through the restaurant with new eyes. He saw now what he'd missed before, the way she switched effortlessly between languages when serving international guests, the intelligence in her eyes when she made recommendations, the quiet competence in every movement. He also saw the sadness she tried to hide, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes, the tension in her shoulders that spoke of carrying weight no one else could see. Someone had hurt her, badly, and Rashid found himself wanting to know who, and wanting to make them pay for it. It was an unfamiliar feeling. He was used to business vendettas, to corporate rivalries, to the cold calculations of profit and loss. But this was different. This was personal in a way that surprised him. When Layla brought his check at the end of the meal, he'd written something on the receipt below his signature. Sunday. 7 p.m. Stubborn Seed. It's quiet, the food is excellent, and I promise to be on my best behavior. Thank you for giving me a chance I don't deserve. Our Layla read it, then looked up at him. You're right. You don't deserve it. I know. But I'm curious enough to show up anyway. That's all I ask. She processed his payment. 20% tip. Exactly as she demanded, and handed back his card. Their fingers brushed for just a moment, and Layla felt an electric current run up her arm. Dangerous, her mind whispered. This is dangerous, but she was so tired of being safe. Being safe had gotten her nowhere. Being invisible had protected her from nothing. Maybe it was time to be dangerous instead. Sunday, she said. Sunday, he confirmed. He stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked toward the exit. At the door he turned back one more time, caught her eye, and smiled. Then he was gone. Layla stood there holding the receipt, her heart pounding, her mind spinning with possibilities and fears, and something that felt dangerously close to hope. Carlos emerged from the kitchen, took one look at her face and shook his head. You're playing with fire. Chica, he said in Spanish. I know, Layla replied in the same language. He's a billionaire. They don't live in the same world as us. I know, you're going to get hurt. Probably, Carlos sighed. But you're going anyway. Yes, and why? Layla looked at the receipt in her hand, at the careful handwriting, at the promise of a chance she thought was gone forever. Because I'm tired of being afraid, she said quietly. Because someone finally looked at me and saw more than a waitress. Because maybe, just maybe, the universe is giving me a second chance and I'm not going to waste it by being too scared to take it. Carlos pulled her into a brief hug. Then be careful, and if he hurts you, let me know. I have knives and I know how to use them. Layla laughed, the sound surprising her. I'll keep that in mind. That night, lying in bed in her small apartment, Layla stared at her phone. Rashid had texted the details as promised, along with a simple message. Looking forward to Sunday. Sleep well, Layla. She typed and deleted 3 different responses before finally settling on, see you then. His reply came immediately. Sweet dreams. Layla set down her phone and stared at the ceiling, her mind too active for sleep. She thought about Sunday, about what she would wear, about what she would say. She thought about whether she should tell him about Marcus, about the stolen research, about the 3 years of pain and humiliation. She thought about her father in the hospital, about the medical bills that kept piling up, about the doctorate she'd abandoned, and the career that had been ripped away from her. And she thought about the way Rashid had looked at her tonight, with respect and curiosity, and something else she was afraid to name. Sunday felt like both a promise and a threat. But Layla Hassan had already made her decision. She was done being invisible. Whatever happened next, she would face it with her head high and her voice strong, the way she'd faced Rashid that first night when he'd tried to diminish her with words he thought she wouldn't understand. She'd proven him wrong then, maybe. She could prove the whole world wrong now, outside her window. Miami glittered with lights and possibilities. Somewhere in that city, Rashid Al-Mansour was probably still awake too, thinking about Sunday, about the mysterious waitress who'd shattered his assumptions and captured his attention in a way no one had in years. Neither of them knew it yet, but Sunday would be the beginning of everything, the beginning of truth, the beginning of justice, the beginning of something. Neither of them had been looking for, but both of them desperately needed. But first, they had to survive the dinner and the secrets that would be revealed over wine and whispered confessions. The clock ticked towards Sunday, and fate held its breath. Sunday arrived wrapped in the golden light of a Miami autumn evening. Layla stood in front of her closet, staring at the limited options, with a mixture of anxiety and determination. She'd spent the last 3 years in uniforms and casual clothes, nothing appropriate for dinner with a billionaire, at one of Miami's most exclusive restaurants. Finally, she settled on a simple navy dress she'd bought for her Columbia graduation before everything fell apart. It was elegant without being flashy, professional without being cold. She paired it with the only good shoes she owned, simple black heels that she'd resoled twice because she couldn't afford to replace them. Her reflection in the mirror showed a woman she barely recognized. Hair down for once, falling in dark waves past her shoulders. Minimal makeup that somehow made her look both younger and more confident. The dress fit differently than it had 3 years ago. She'd lost weight from stress and long shifts, but it still worked. She looked like the person she used to be, the person she might become again. Her phone buzzed. A text from Rashid. "I know you said no car, but I'm parked outside anyway. No pressure. You can still take an Uber if you prefer, but I'm here if you want company for the drive." Layla looked out her window and saw the Rolls-Royce parked on her modest street, looking as out of place as a diamond in a drawer of costume jewelry. Rashid stood beside it in a charcoal suit, no tie, looking at his phone. She could still back out. She could text him that she'd changed her mind, that this was a mistake, that they lived in different worlds and should stay there. Instead, she grabbed her purse, locked her apartment, and walked downstairs. Rashid looked up as she emerged from the building, and the expression on his face made her breath catch. It wasn't the calculating look of a businessman or the arrogant assessment of a wealthy man. It was simple, genuine appreciation. "You look beautiful," he said. "You look surprised," Layla replied. "Not surprised, just reminded that I'm an idiot who needed you to quote poetry at me before I actually saw you." Despite her nerves, Layla smiled. "At least you're a self-aware idiot. It's my best quality." He opened the car door for her. "Shall we?" The drive to Stubborn Seed took 15 minutes through Miami's evening traffic. They sat in comfortable silence at first, the city lights streaming past the windows. Then Rashid spoke. "I did some research this week," he said carefully. "I hope you don't mind. I wanted to understand more about your academic background." Layla stiffened. "What kind of research?" "The public kind. Your master's thesis is available through Columbia's library." "I read it. All 93 pages." She turned to stare at him. "You read my thesis?" "Twice. The first time to understand it, the second time to appreciate it. Your analysis of code switching in multilingual business environments was brilliant. The way you mapped linguistic patterns against socio-economic factors," he shook his head. "It should have launched a significant academic career." "It should have," Layla said quietly. "But it didn't. Why not?" "That's a long story. We have all evening." Layla looked out the window, watching Miami blur past. "Maybe, but let's eat first. I don't want to ruin dinner with ancient history." "Ancient history that still hurts isn't ancient," Rashid observed. "But yes, we'll eat first. I promised you good food and good conversation. The difficult conversations can wait until you're ready." They arrived at Stubborn Seed, an intimate restaurant in South Beach known for its innovative cuisine and quiet atmosphere. The maitre d' greeted Rashid by name and led them to a private corner table away from other diners. "You come here often?" Layla asked as they sat down. "First time. But I may have called ahead and explained that I needed privacy and discretion for an important dinner." "Important? Very." The sommelier appeared with a wine list. Rashid glanced at it, then looked at Layla. "Do you prefer red or white?" "I prefer that you don't spend $1,000 on wine to impress me." "What if I want to spend $1,000 on wine because I appreciate good wine?" "Then you have more money than sense." Rashid laughed, a genuine sound that transformed his face. "Fair point. How about we compromise? You choose the wine, whatever you think pairs well with the tasting menu, and I promise not to look at the price." Layla took the wine list, scanned it with the practiced eye of someone who'd served wine for 3 years, and selected a Chateauneuf du Pape that was excellent but not excessive. The sommelier nodded approvingly and disappeared. "Good choice," Rashid said. "I know. Confident. I like that. You didn't like it 4 days ago. 4 days ago I was an arrogant fool who mistook humility for weakness. I'm trying to be better." The first course arrived, hamachi crudo with citrus and jalapeno. They ate in silence for a moment. The food excellent, the atmosphere comfortable despite the weight of unspoken questions. "Tell me about Dubai," Layla said finally. "What's it like to grow up there?" Rashid seemed surprised by the question, but he answered readily. "Complicated. I was born in 1975, when Dubai was still more desert than city. My father was in oil, but he saw the future, that oil wouldn't last forever, that Dubai needed to diversify. He invested in real estate, in tourism, in infrastructure. By the time I was 20, we were wealthy. By the time I was 30, we were very wealthy. And you took over the company?" "Eventually. My father died when I was 35. Heart attack. He was only 62. Rashid's voice carried old pain. "He worked himself to death building an empire, and I inherited it along with the responsibility of not letting it crumble. That's a heavy burden. It is. But it's also a privilege. I have resources that most people can't imagine. I can make things happen with a phone call. I can change lives with a signature. He paused. But I've also spent the last 13 years so focused on maintaining and growing what my father built that I forgot why it matters. I forgot that wealth is supposed to serve a purpose beyond accumulating more wealth. And what purpose is that? I'm still figuring it out. But I think it has something to do with using power to elevate rather than diminish, with recognizing value in unexpected places. He stopped, looking directly at her. With meeting a waitress who quotes Al-Mutanabi and reminds you that intelligence and worth have nothing to do with bank accounts. Layla felt heat rise in her cheeks. That's a lot of pressure to put on one poetry quote. Maybe, but it's true. The second course arrived, duck breast with cherry gastrique. They ate and talked, the conversation flowing more easily now. Rashid asked about her childhood in Miami, about her parents, about how she'd discovered her love of languages. My mother was Lebanese, Layla explained. She spoke Arabic at home, English everywhere else. My father is Mexican-American, so Spanish was always around too. I grew up switching between 3 languages, without thinking about it, and I became fascinated by how language shapes thought, how the same idea feels different in different tongues. That's what led you to linguistics, that and stubbornness. Everyone told me it wasn't practical, that I should study business or law or something with better job prospects. But I loved it too much to give it up. Her expression darkened. Turns out they were right about the job prospects, or turns out that someone sabotaged your prospects, Rashid said quietly. Which brings us to the difficult conversation. Layla set down her fork, her appetite suddenly gone. Yes, I suppose it does. You don't have to tell me if you're not ready. I'm not sure I'll ever be ready. But you've been honest with me, so I'll be honest with you. She took a breath. His name was Marcus Whitmore. He was a professor assistant at Columbia, working on his own doctorate while teaching undergraduate courses. I met him in my second year of graduate school. He was brilliant, charming, and he seemed genuinely interested in my research. Rashid's expression had gone very still, very focused. We started dating, Layla continued, her voice steady despite the pain of the memories. It was intense, passionate. He said he'd never met anyone as intelligent as me, that my ideas were revolutionary. When I started my doctorate, he offered to help, to collaborate. I was flattered. I was in love. I was an idiot. You were trusting, Rashid corrected gently. Same thing, apparently. Layla's laugh was bitter. I was working on artificial intelligence applications for real-time translation, specifically focused on preserving dialectical nuances and cultural context that most translation software loses. It was groundbreaking work, or at least it could have been. I shared everything with Marcus, my research, my algorithms, my data sets. He was my partner in every sense. She paused, taking a sip of wine to steady herself. Then one day I came across a paper being presented at a major tech conference. The author was Marcus Whitmore. The topic was AI-driven translation with cultural context preservation. The methodology was identical to mine. The algorithms were mine. Even some of the phrasing in the abstract was lifted directly from my notes. Rashid's jaw tightened. He stole your work, all of it. 2 years of research gone. When I confronted him, he denied it at first. Then he got angry. He said I couldn't prove anything, that ideas can't be copyrighted, that I was being paranoid and jealous of his success. He said if I tried to make trouble, he'd destroy me. And did you? Try to make trouble? I tried to fight. I went to the department head, to my advisor, to the university administration. But Marcus had been careful. He'd published first, he had connections, and he was charming enough to make me look like a bitter ex-girlfriend making false accusations. My advisor suggested I was confused about the timeline. The department head said these things were complicated, and maybe we'd collaborated more than I remembered. Layla's hands were shaking now. Rashid reached across the table and covered them with his own, warm and steady. They didn't believe you, he said. Worse, they didn't want to believe me. Marcus was their golden boy, about to bring prestige and funding to the department. I was just a graduate student, replaceable and inconvenient. So they chose him. What happened next? Marcus's paper was a sensation. He got offers from Stanford, MIT, Berkeley. He chose Stanford, along with a $2 million research grant and a contract with a major tech company to develop the software. My software, built on my research. She pulled her hands back, wrapping them around her wine glass. I tried to continue my doctorate with different research, but my heart wasn't in it. My advisor was cold, my peers whispered, and Marcus had poisoned enough wells that no one wanted to work with me. I lasted 6 more months before I quit. I moved back to Miami to take care of my father. He'd been diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer, and I needed money fast for his treatment. Zuma was hiring. The rest you know. The silence that followed was heavy. Rashid's expression had transformed from sympathetic to something harder, colder, more dangerous. "This Marcus Whitmore," he said quietly. "He's at Stanford now?" "As far as I know. Probably still riding high on my stolen work." "And the software?" "The tech company contract?" "I don't know the details. I stopped following it. It hurt too much." Rashid pulled out his phone and typed something quickly. "What was the name of the company?" "Rashid, what are you—" "The company name, Layla." Something in his tone made her answer. "Linguitech Solutions." "But why does it matter? It's been 3 years." "The statute of limitations on academic misconduct is probably—" "There's no statute of limitations on theft," Rashid interrupted. "And there's definitely no statute of limitations on justice." He looked up from his phone, his eyes blazing with an intensity that was almost frightening. "Do you still have your original research? Notes, drafts, anything with dates?" Yes, I kept everything. I couldn't bring myself to delete it, even though looking at it kills me." "Good. Don't delete anything. In fact, back it up everywhere. Cloud storage, external drives, email it to yourself. Do it tonight." "Rashid, what are you planning?" He set down his phone and looked at her with an expression that was part determination, part fury, and part something that looked almost like joy. "I'm planning to give you back what was stolen," he said. "I'm planning to expose Marcus Whitmore for the fraud he is. And I'm planning to make sure that everyone who dismissed you, everyone who chose to believe him over you, everyone who let this injustice stand for 3 years, understands exactly what they did." Layla's heart was pounding. "You can't just—" "I can. I have lawyers who specialize in intellectual property theft. I have investigators who can trace digital footprints and establish timelines. I have connections at Stanford, at Columbia, at every major tech company in Silicon Valley. And most importantly, I have something Marcus Whitmore doesn't have. What's that?" Rashid smiled, and it was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who'd built a billion-dollar empire by being smarter, faster, and more ruthless than his competition. "I have the truth, and I have unlimited resources to make sure the truth comes out." Layla felt tears burning behind her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of something she'd almost forgotten. "Hope. Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this for me?" Rashid reached across the table again, and this time when he took her hands, she didn't pull away. "Because you deserve justice," he said simply. "Because talent and hard work should be rewarded, not stolen. Because I have the power to fix this, and what good is power if you don't use it to make things right?" He paused, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture that was both comforting and electric. "And because," he continued, his voice softer now, "in the 4 days since I met you, you've reminded me of something I'd forgotten. That the world is full of brilliant people being held back by circumstances or by people who wronged them. That wealth means nothing if you use it only to accumulate more wealth. That sometimes the universe puts someone in your path for a reason, and you think I'm that someone. I think you're extraordinary, Layla Hassan. I think you were extraordinary when I was too blind and arrogant to see it, and you're extraordinary now that I've finally opened my eyes. Can I think that if I can help you get back what was stolen, if I can help you reclaim your career and your future, then maybe all this wealth and power my father left me will finally mean something beyond numbers in a bank account." Layla couldn't speak. The tears were falling now, silent and unstoppable. Rashid produced a handkerchief. Of course he had a handkerchief, he was that kind of man, and handed it to her. "I'm sorry," she managed. "I'm not usually this emotional. You're allowed to be emotional. Someone stole 3 years of your life. You're allowed to cry about it, and then you're allowed to get angry about it. And then we're going to do something about it." We if you'll let me help. Layla wiped her eyes, took a shaky breath, and looked at this man who'd insulted her in Arabic 4 days ago and was now offering to wage war on her behalf. Why do I feel like I'm making a deal with the devil? She asked. Rashid laughed. Because you're smart enough to know that I'm not doing this purely out of altruism. Yes, I want to help you because it's right, but I also want to help you because I find you fascinating, because I want to know you better, and because spending time with you makes me feel more alive than I've felt in years. That's honest, I'm trying to be. You deserve honesty, especially after Marcus's lies. The waiter appeared with the next course, but neither of them paid much attention to it. They were too focused on each other, on the strange alliance forming between them, on the possibilities opening up like flowers in the sun. If we do this, Layla said slowly, if we really go after Marcus, it's going to be ugly. He'll fight back. He has connections, reputation, resources. So do I, more than he does. He'll try to destroy my credibility again. Let him try. This time you won't be alone. This time you'll have lawyers, investigators, and a very angry billionaire who doesn't lose fights. You're that confident? I'm that determined. There's a difference. Layla looked at him for a long moment. This complicated man who'd entered her life with cruelty and was now offering salvation. She thought about her father in the hospital, about the career she'd lost, about 3 years of serving tables and swallowing her pride and pretending she was less than she was. She thought about Marcus, probably sleeping soundly in California, never imagining that the woman he'd destroyed was about to rise from the ashes with a weapon he couldn't fight, the truth, and a very powerful ally. Okay, she said. Let's do it. Let's take him down. Rashid's smile was fierce and triumphant. That's my girl. I'm not your girl, not yet. But I'm patient. Despite everything, Layla laughed. You're impossible. I'm effective. There's a difference. They finished dinner talking strategy, timelines, and next steps. Rashid made calls between courses, his assistants apparently working even on Sunday evening. By the time dessert arrived, he'd already assembled a team, 3 intellectual property lawyers, 2 private investigators, and a forensic digital analyst. They'll start tomorrow, he said, scrolling through his phone. So I need you to send them everything you have. Research notes, drafts, emails, anything with timestamps. The investigators will establish a timeline, the analysts will trace the digital trail, and the lawyers will build the case. This is moving very fast. I don't believe in wasting time. Not when justice is at stake, and not when you want something of that too. They left the restaurant near midnight, full of excellent food and expensive wine, and something that felt dangerously close to partnership. Rashid drove her home, and this time the silence was comfortable, charged with possibility rather than tension. When they pulled up outside her apartment building, Layla turned to him. Thank you, she said. For dinner, for listening, for everything. Thank me when Marcus Whitmore is exposed and you're back where you belong. And where is that? Wherever you want to be. Teaching, researching, consulting, building your own company, whatever makes you happy. You have options now, Layla. You just don't know it yet. She reached for the door handle, then paused. Rashid, why are you really doing this? He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Because 4 days ago I insulted a woman in Arabic, assuming she was too ignorant to understand. And she responded by quoting poetry that cut straight to the truth of who I'd become. Someone who'd forgotten that wealth without character is worthless. You gave me a gift that night, even if it felt like a sword. You reminded me of who I want to be. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture intimate and gentle. So, yes, I want to help you, because it's right. But I also want to help you because you've already helped me, in ways you don't even realize. And because when I look at you, I see someone extraordinary who deserves extraordinary things. Let me give you that, please. Layla's breath caught. They were close now. Close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. Close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him. This is complicated, she whispered. The best things usually are. I don't know if I can trust this. Trust you? Then don't, not yet. Let me earn it. Let me prove that I'm not Marcus, that I'm not going to take from you or hurt you or disappear when things get difficult. Let me show you that some people actually mean what they say. He pulled back, giving her space, respecting her boundaries even as his eyes promised things that made her heart race. Go inside, Layla. Back up your research. Get some sleep. Tomorrow we start fighting back together. Layla nodded, not trusting her voice. She got out of the car, walked to her building, and turned back one more time. Rashid was still there, watching to make sure she got inside safely. She waved. He waved back. Then she went inside, climbed the stairs to her apartment, and the moment the door closed behind her, she let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Her phone buzzed. A text from Rashid. Thank you for trusting me with your story. Sleep well. Tomorrow we change everything. Our Layla looked around her small apartment, at the life she'd built from the ruins of her dreams, at the modest furniture and the stack of medical bills on the counter and the Columbia diploma she'd hidden in a drawer because it hurt too much to look at. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow she would stop being a victim and become a fighter. Tomorrow, with a billionaire Sheikh as her unlikely ally, she would take back what was stolen and reclaim the future that should have been hers all along. But tonight, she had work to do. Layla opened her laptop, logged into her cloud storage, and began uploading files. Research notes from 2019, draft papers with timestamps, emails with Marcus discussing her ideas that he'd later claimed as his own, screenshots of conversations, everything. It took 3 hours to organize and back up everything. But when she finally finished, she felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years, power. She had the evidence. She had the truth. And now, she had an ally who had the resources to make sure the truth came out. Marcus Whitmore had no idea what was coming, but he was about to find out. Layla sent a final email to the legal team Rashid had assembled, attaching the organized files with a cover note explaining the timeline. Then she sent one more text. Files sent. Ready to fight. Thank you for believing me. The response came immediately. Even though it was past 3 a.m., I'll always believe you. Now get some sleep. You're going to need your strength. We have a war to win. Layla smiled, set down her phone, and finally allowed herself to sleep. And for the first time in 3 years, she dreamed not of loss and betrayal, but of justice and victory and a future that was finally within reach. The war was about to begin, and this time, Layla Hassan wasn't fighting alone. The next 2 weeks moved with the speed and precision of a military operation. Rashid's legal team worked around the clock, and Layla found herself pulled into a world she'd never imagined. Conference calls with attorneys, meetings with investigators, sessions with the digital forensic analyst who traced every keystroke and timestamp of her stolen research. She still worked her shifts at Zuma, but now her breaks were spent on the phone with lawyers, instead of scrolling mindlessly through social media. Her days off were consumed by depositions, evidence review, and strategy sessions in Rashid's temporary Miami office, a penthouse suite at the Four Seasons that he'd converted into a war room. And through it all, Rashid was there, not hovering, not controlling, but present. He sat in on meetings, asked sharp questions, and made it clear to everyone involved that this case was personal to him. His lawyers quickly learned that half measures wouldn't be tolerated, that he expected excellence and that failure wasn't an option. But with Layla, he was different, patient, gentle, supportive. He brought her coffee during long meetings. He ordered food when she forgot to eat. He sent his car to pick her up after late shifts so she wouldn't have to take the bus. And when the stress became too much, when she broke down crying over a particularly damning email from Marcus that the investigators had uncovered, Rashid simply held her and let her cry without trying to fix it or minimize it or rush her through it. "You're allowed to feel this," he said quietly, his hand rubbing circles on her back. "You're allowed to be angry and hurt and overwhelmed. This is hard, but you're doing it anyway, and that makes you the bravest person I know," Layla pulled back, wiping her eyes. "I don't feel brave. I feel terrified. Bravery isn't the absence of fear. It's doing the right thing despite the fear. You're facing the man who destroyed you, Layla. That takes courage most people don't have." They were in his penthouse office, surrounded by documents and laptops and whiteboards covered in timelines. It was late, past midnight, and the lawyers had finally gone home. Just the two of them remained, exhausted and wired and bound together by this strange mission. "Can I ask you something?" Layla said. "Anything. Why haven't you tried to kiss me?" Rashid looked surprised, then smiled. "Because you're not ready. Because you're vulnerable right now. And I don't want you to wonder later if I took advantage of that vulnerability." Because when I kiss you, and I will kiss you, Layla, make no mistake about that, I want you to be sure. I want you to choose it, not fall into it because you're grateful or overwhelmed or caught up in the intensity of all this. That's very noble of you. It's very selfish of me. I don't want gratitude. I want you to want me the way I want you, completely, consciously, with no doubts and no regrets. Layla's heart was pounding. And you think that's going to happen? I hope it will. But if it doesn't, I'll survive. And I'll still help you destroy Marcus Whitmore. Because that's the right thing to do regardless of what happens between us. You're a complicated man. Rashid Al-Mansur. I'm a man who knows what he wants and is willing to wait for it. That's not complicated. That's just patient. Before Layla could respond, Rashid's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and his expression sharpened. It's Davidson, the lead investigator. He said he'd call if he found something significant, he answered. Talk to me. Layla watched his face as he listened, saw his eyes narrow, saw the predatory smile that curved his lips. You're certain? The evidence is solid. A pause. Excellent. Send me everything. I want it on my desk in an hour. Another pause. No, don't contact Stanford yet. We do this strategically. I'll call you tomorrow with next steps. He hung up and looked at Layla with an expression of fierce triumph. We've got him. What did they find? Everything. Davidson traced Marcus's digital footprint back 3 years. Every file he accessed, every document he created, every email he sent. And here's the beautiful part, he was sloppy. He copied your files directly from the shared Columbia server, and the metadata is still intact. Timestamps, author information, edit history, all of it. Rashid pulled up his laptop and turned it toward her. Look at this. This is your original research file, created in March 2019. And this, he clicked to another document, is Marcus's original paper, created in November 2019. But when Davidson examined the metadata, guess what he found? What? The file properties still list you as the original author. Marcus copied your work, changed the name on the document, but forgot to scrub the metadata. It's all there, Layla. Proof that he stole your research, proof of the timeline, proof of everything. Layla stared at the screen, her hands shaking. That's enough. That's more than enough. Combined with your original notes, your emails, and the testimony we've gathered from other students Marcus worked with. Yes, we found 3 others he did this to, though none as extensively as you. We have an airtight case. What happens now? Rashid's smile was cold and calculating. Now we decide how we want to destroy him. Quietly, through legal channels and university investigations, or publicly, in a way that ensures everyone knows exactly what he did. What do you recommend? Publicly. Absolutely publicly. Men like Marcus count on their victims staying silent, on shame and fear keeping the truth hidden. But you're not going to stay silent anymore, Layla. You're going to stand up in front of everyone and show them exactly what he is. That's terrifying. I know. But I'll be right there with you. And when it's over, when Marcus Whitmore's career is in ruins and your name is cleared and everyone knows the truth, you'll be able to hold your head high knowing that you didn't just get justice for yourself. You got it for every other person he victimized, and you made sure he can never do it again. Layla looked at the evidence on the screen, at the proof of Marcus's theft laid out in black and white, and felt something shift inside her. The fear was still there, but it was joined by something stronger. Anger, righteous, burning anger at the man who'd stolen her work, her career, her future. At the system that had protected him and dismissed her. At everyone who'd chosen to believe his lies instead of her truth. Let's do it, she said, her voice steady. Let's expose him publicly. I want everyone to know what he did. That's my girl. I'm still not your girl. Keep telling yourself that. Despite everything, Layla laughed. Then she looked at Rashid. Really looked at him. This man who'd entered her life with insults and arrogance and had somehow become her champion, her ally, her something. Thank you, she said quietly. For all of this? For believing me when no one else did. For using your resources to fight for me. For Layla, yes? Stop thanking me. This isn't charity. This is justice. And honestly, he reached out and took her hand. Getting to know you, watching you find your strength again, seeing you transform from that scared waitress into the warrior you're becoming, that's worth more than any business deal I've ever made. So if anyone should be saying thank you, it's me. They sat there in the quiet penthouse, hands linked, surrounded by evidence of betrayal and the promise of justice, and Layla felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt like herself again, not the broken version Marcus had left behind, not the invisible waitress hiding from the world, but the real Layla Hassan, brilliant, strong, and ready to fight. "What's the timeline?" she asked. "Davidson needs a few more days to finalize everything. Then we contact Stanford, Columbia, and Linguitech simultaneously. We present the evidence. We demand investigations, and we make it very clear that if they don't act immediately and decisively, we're going to the press with everything." Will they act? They won't have a choice. The evidence is too strong, and I'm going to make sure they understand that protecting Marcus will cost them far more than exposing him. Stanford doesn't want to be known as the university that harbored an academic fraud. Linguitech doesn't want their flagship product revealed as stolen technology, and Columbia doesn't want the scandal of having dismissed a legitimate complaint. So we're leveraging their self-interest. Exactly. Justice is great, but self-preservation is a much more reliable motivator. Layla smiled despite herself. "You're cynical. I'm realistic. I've been in business long enough to know that people rarely do the right thing because it's right. They do it because not doing it will cost them something they value. So we make sure the cost of protecting Marcus is higher than the cost of exposing him. And then you get your life back. Your reputation, your career, your future. Everything he stole you reclaim. It sounds too good to be true. It's not. It's just what happens when you have the truth, the evidence, and unlimited resources on your side." Rashid squeezed her hand. "You're going to win this, Layla. I promise you that." She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him so badly it hurt. What if something goes wrong? What if Marcus has some defense we haven't thought of? What if, then we adapt, we fight harder, we find another angle, but we don't give up, and we don't let him win again. Understood? Understood. Good, now go home and get some sleep. You have a shift tomorrow, and you're going to need your energy for what's coming. Layla stood, gathering her things. Rashid walked her to the door, and when she turned to say goodbye, she found him closer than she expected. "Layla?" "Yes?" "When this is over, when Marcus is exposed and you're free from all of this, I'm going to ask you on a real date. Not a business dinner, not a strategy session. A real date, where we talk about things that have nothing to do with revenge or justice or stolen research. And what if I say no? Then I'll accept it and move on. But I don't think you will. Confident, hopeful. There's a difference." He leaned down and kissed her forehead, a gesture that was both chaste and intimate, and Layla felt warmth spread through her chest. "Good night, Layla. Good night." Rashid. She left the penthouse and rode the elevator down to the lobby, where Rashid's driver was waiting to take her home. As Miami's lights streamed past the car windows, Layla pulled out her phone and looked at the evidence files Davidson had sent. Proof. Finally. After 3 years, she had proof. And in less than a week, the whole world would know the truth. Marcus Whitmore's comfortable life was about to come crashing down, and Layla Hassan was going to be the one to bring the hammer. She smiled in the darkness of the car, and it was not a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who'd been knocked down, who'd spent years in the dirt, and who was finally getting back up, stronger, angrier, and absolutely ready for war. 5 days later, Layla stood in a conference room at Stanford University, surrounded by lawyers, university administrators, and representatives from Linguitech Solutions. Rashid sat beside her, his presence a solid anchor in the storm of nervous energy coursing through her body. Across the table sat Marcus Whitmore. He'd aged in 3 years. His boyish charm hardened into something more calculating. When he'd walked into the room and seen Layla, his face had gone pale, then flushed with anger. "What is this?" he'd demanded. "Why is she here?" "Dr. Whitmore," said Dean Patricia Morrison of Stanford's Computer Science Department, her voice cold. "Please sit down. We have some very serious matters to discuss." Now 30 minutes into the meeting, Marcus's confident facade was crumbling. Davidson, the lead investigator, had just finished presenting the evidence. Metadata showing Layla as the original author. Timestamps proving her research predated Marcus's by 8 months. Emails where Marcus had discussed Layla's brilliant algorithm before later claiming it as his own. Testimony from 3 other students describing similar patterns of theft. It was devastating, comprehensive, irrefutable. Marcus had tried to interrupt several times, his voice rising in protest, but the lawyers had shut him down with cold efficiency. The evidence speaks for itself. "Dr. Whitmore," said Jennifer Chen, Rashid's lead attorney. "You copied Ms. Hassan's research, published it as your own, and built your entire career on stolen work. The metadata alone is damning, but combined with the testimony and the documentary evidence, there's no question of what happened here." "This is ridiculous," Marcus sputtered. "She's a disgruntled ex-girlfriend making false accusations. I already went through this 3 years ago at Columbia, and they found no merit to her claims." "Actually," interjected David Rashkind, the attorney representing Columbia University, who'd been invited to this meeting, "Columbia is reopening that investigation in light of new evidence. The original inquiry was insufficient. That was a polite way of saying they'd buried it, and everyone in the room knew it." Dean Morrison leaned forward. "Dr. Whitmore, I'm going to be very direct. The evidence against you is overwhelming. Stanford takes academic integrity extremely seriously, and what you've done constitutes the most serious form of misconduct. We are suspending you immediately pending a full investigation, and I expect that investigation will result in termination and the revocation of your position." "You can't do this." Marcus's voice was panicked now. "I have tenure track, I have contracts, I have—" "You have nothing," Rashid said quietly, speaking for the first time. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but there was steel underneath. "Your position was based on fraudulent credentials. Your research grants were obtained through deception. Your reputation was built on stolen work. It's all gone, Dr. Whitmore, all of it." Marcus turned to glare at him. "And who the hell are you?" "Sheikh Rashid Al-Mansour. I'm Ms. Hassan's advocate, and I'm the person who funded this investigation, hired these lawyers, and made sure that every piece of evidence was documented and verified beyond any possible doubt." "You're her sugar daddy, you mean? She's sleeping with you for money and revenge." The room went silent. Layla felt Rashid tense beside her, but before he could respond, she spoke. "No, Marcus." Her voice was steady, clear, and cold as ice. "I'm not sleeping with him. I'm working with him because, unlike you, he actually respects my intelligence and my work. He believes me when I speak. He values my contributions. All the things you pretended to do while you were stealing from me." She stood, and everyone's attention shifted to her. "For 3 years, I've lived with what you did to me. I've served tables. I've hidden my degree. I've made myself small and invisible because you destroyed my confidence and my career. You stole 2 years of my life's work, published it as your own, and then convinced everyone that I was crazy for saying so." Her voice was rising now, years of suppressed anger finally finding release. "You made me doubt myself. You made me question my own memory, my own worth. You took something I loved, research, academia, the pursuit of knowledge, and you turned it into a source of pain and shame. You didn't just steal my work, Marcus. You stole my future." Marcus was pale now, his earlier bravado completely gone. "But here's what you didn't count on," Layla continued. "You didn't count on me keeping every piece of evidence. You didn't count on your own sloppiness with metadata. You didn't count on the other people you victimized being willing to come forward. And you definitely didn't count on me finding someone with the resources and the determination to make sure the truth came out." She leaned forward, her hands flat on the conference table. "So yes, I'm here for revenge, but I'm also here for justice. For me, for the 3 other students you stole from, and for every future student who might have been your next victim. You're done, Marcus. Your career is over. Your reputation is destroyed, and everyone is going to know exactly what you are." The silence that followed was absolute. Then Dean Morrison spoke. "Ms. Hassan, on behalf of Stanford University, I want to apologize. We should have investigated more thoroughly when we hired Dr. Whitmore. We should have verified his credentials more carefully. We failed you, and for that I'm truly sorry." "Your apology is noted," Rashid said before Layla could respond. "But apologies aren't enough. Stanford is going to issue a public statement, acknowledging the fraud, clearing Ms. Hassan's name and detailing exactly what Dr. Whitmore did. You're also going to contact every institution and publication that cited his stolen research and inform them of the truth." "That's non-negotiable," Rashid interrupted. "Unless you'd prefer we take this to the press first and let them write the story." I'm sure they'd be very interested in how Stanford hired a known academic fraud and built a prestigious program around stolen research. Dean Morrison's jaw tightened, but she nodded. We'll issue the statement. Excellent. And Linguitech? Rashid turned to the company representatives, who'd been silent throughout the meeting. You have a $2 million contract based on fraudulent research. I assume you'll be terminating that immediately and pursuing legal action against Dr. Whitmore for fraud. The Linguitech CEO, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah Chen, nodded. We're terminating the contract today. And yes, we'll be pursuing damages, but we'd also like to speak with Ms. Hassan about potentially working with us directly, since the research was actually hers. Layla blinked in surprise. What? Your work is brilliant, Ms. Hassan. The algorithm you developed is exactly what we need. We'd like to offer you a consulting position, with appropriate compensation and full credit for your contributions, if you're interested. Layla looked at Rashid, who smiled encouragingly. I'll need to think about it. Of course. Take all the time you need. We'll be in touch. Dean Morrison stood. Dr. Whitmore, you need to come with me. We have more to discuss regarding the termination process and the return of any university property in your possession. Marcus stood slowly, his face ashen. He looked at Layla one more time, and she saw something in his eyes that might have been regret, or might have just been self-pity. Layla, don't, she said flatly. Don't apologize, don't explain. Don't try to make this about anything other than what it is. You're a thief and a liar and you got caught. That's all there is to say. Marcus opened his mouth, closed it, then followed Dean Morrison out of the room like a man walking to his execution. When the door closed behind them, Layla's legs suddenly felt weak. She sat down hard and Rashid's hand was immediately on her shoulder, steady and warm. You did it, he said quietly. You faced him, you told the truth, and you won. We won, Layla corrected. I couldn't have done this without you. You could have. It just would have taken longer. But yes, we make a good team. The lawyers were packing up their materials, congratulating each other on a successful outcome. Jennifer Chen approached Layla with a smile. That was incredibly brave. Ms. Hassan, I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've never seen a victim confront their abuser with that much strength and clarity. You should be very proud. Thank you, Layla managed. We'll handle the rest from here, the public statements, the notifications to academic journals, the coordination with Columbia's investigation. You can finally rest. After the lawyers left, Layla and Rashid sat alone in the conference room. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the table where justice had finally been served. How do you feel? Rashid asked. Layla thought about it. Empty, relieved, angry, vindicated, exhausted, all of it at once. That's normal. You've been carrying this for 3 years. It's going to take time to process what just happened. He looked so small, Layla said quietly. When we walked in, I was terrified. I thought he'd still have that power over me, that confidence that made me doubt myself. But when I actually saw him, when I heard him try to lie his way out of it, he just looked pathetic. Because he is pathetic. He's a mediocre talent who stole from someone brilliant because he knew he could never create anything that good on his own. And now everyone knows it. Layla turned to look at Rashid. What happens now? Now you decide what you want to do with your future. You have options, Layla. Linguitech wants to work with you. I guarantee other companies will too once word gets out. Universities will be interested in having you complete your doctorate. You could teach, research, consult, start your own company, whatever you want. That's overwhelming. Then don't decide today. Take time, rest, process, figure out what actually makes you happy, not what you think you should do. What if I don't know? Then we'll figure it out together. If you want my help, that is, Layla smiled. You're very persistent. I told you I know what I want, and what's that? Rashid stood and offered her his hand. Right now, I want to take you somewhere that isn't a conference room or a law office or a restaurant where you used to work. Somewhere you can breathe and think and just be Layla Hassan, brilliant linguist, without all the weight of the past 3 years. Where did you have in mind? Do you trust me? Layla looked at his outstretched hand, thought about everything he'd done for her over the past 3 weeks, about how he'd believed her when no one else did, about how he'd used his power to lift her up instead of push her down. Yes, she said. I trust you. She took his hand and he pulled her to her feet. Good. Then let's go. Rashid's driver took them south, away from Stanford's campus, away from the city, toward the coast. They drove in comfortable silence, Layla watching the landscape change from urban to suburban to wild, until finally they pulled up to a private beach access point. "Where are we?" Layla asked, somewhere quiet. "Somewhere you can scream if you want to, or cry, or just sit and watch the ocean. Whatever you need." They walked down to the beach, Layla carrying her heels in one hand, her feet sinking into cool sand. The Pacific stretched out before them, vast and endless, and the sound of waves was like a meditation. They sat on the sand side by side, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. "I used to come here when I first moved to California," Rashid said. "When the pressure of running the company got too intense, when I needed to remember that there's a world beyond board meetings and profit margins. The ocean doesn't care how much money you have or what your title is. It just exists, powerful and indifferent. I find that comforting." "It is comforting," Layla agreed. "Makes my problems feel smaller." "Your problems aren't small, but they're also not permanent." Today proved that. Layla drew her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. "I keep waiting to feel different. Like there should be this moment of triumph, of pure joy. But mostly I just feel tired. That's because you've been in survival mode for 3 years. Your body and mind are exhausted. Give yourself time to recover. How much time?" "However much you need." They sat in silence for a while, watching seabirds wheel overhead and waves crash against the shore. Then Layla spoke. "Can I ask you something?" "Always. What do you get out of this, really? You've spent weeks of your time, probably hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees, all to help someone you barely know. Why?" Rashid was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the ocean. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "Do you know what it's like to have everything and feel empty? To wake up in a different luxury hotel every week, to have assistants and drivers and people who jump when you speak, and to realize that none of it means anything, that you've spent years accumulating wealth and power, and you can't remember the last time you did something that actually mattered." He turned to look at her. "That's where I was when I walked into Zuma 3 weeks ago. Arrogant, disconnected, treating people like they were invisible because I'd forgotten how to see them as human. And then you, this woman I dismissed as insignificant, you looked me in the eye and quoted poetry that cut straight to the truth of who I'd become. I was angry. You were right. And you woke something up in me that I thought was dead. The part of me that my father raised, the part that believed wealth was a responsibility, not just a privilege, the part that wanted to build things and help people and make a difference beyond just making more money." He reached out and took her hand. "So what do I get out of this? I get to remember who I wanted to be before I got lost in the empire. I get to use my resources for something that actually matters. I get to watch someone brilliant reclaim their future. And I get to spend time with a woman who challenges me, who doesn't care about my money, who quotes Al-Mutanabi and speaks 7 languages and makes me want to be better." Layla's heart was pounding. "Rashid, I'm not asking for anything, Layla. I'm just answering your question honestly. You asked what I get out of this, and the truth is, I get you. Your friendship, your trust, your presence in my life, that's worth more than any business deal I've ever made. That's a lot of pressure. Then don't think of it as pressure. Think of it as possibility. We don't have to define what this is right now. We don't have to make promises or commitments. We can just be 2 people who found each other at the right time, who helped each other become better versions of themselves. And if I'm not ready for more than that, then that's what we'll be. Friends, allies, partners in crime against academic frauds." He smiled. "I meant what I said before, Layla. I'm patient. I can wait for you to be ready if you ever are. And if you're never ready, I'll accept that too." Layla looked at their joined hands, at the way his thumb was tracing gentle circles on her skin, at the way the setting sun painted everything in gold and amber. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Marcus destroyed me. The idea of trusting someone again, of being vulnerable again, it terrifies me." "I know. And I'm not asking you to trust me completely right now. Trust is earned, not given. So let me keep earning it. Let me keep showing you that not everyone is Marcus, that some people actually mean what they say and do what they promise. And if I hurt you in the process, if I'm too damaged, too broken, too—" "You're not broken," Rashid interrupted firmly. "You're healing. There's a difference. Broken things can't function. But you faced your abuser today. You stood up in front of everyone and told your truth. You won your justice. That's not broken, Layla, that's strong. Tears were streaming down her face now, but they weren't sad tears. They were relief. The emotional dam finally breaking after 3 years of holding everything in. Rashid pulled her close, and she let him, burying her face in his shoulder and crying out all the pain and fear and anger she'd been carrying. He held her without speaking, one hand stroking her hair, the other wrapped securely around her waist, anchoring her through the storm. When she finally pulled back, her eyes were red but clear, her expression lighter than he'd ever seen it. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what? For seeing me, for believing me, for giving me back my voice. You always had your voice, Layla. I just helped you remember how to use it." The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. They sat together on the beach, watching the day end and a new chapter begin. And for the first time in 3 years, Layla Hassan felt something she'd almost forgotten. Peace. Not happiness yet. That would come later. Slowly, as she rebuilt her life and her confidence. But peace. The knowledge that justice had been served, that the truth had come out, that she'd faced her demon and won. "What happens tomorrow?" she asked. "Tomorrow, Stanford issues their statement. The press picks it up. Your name gets cleared publicly. And you start getting calls from people who want to work with you, learn from you, collaborate with you. That sounds overwhelming. It will be, but you'll handle it. And I'll be there to help if you want me to be. I do want that. Your help, your friendship, your presence. You have it, for as long as you want it." Layla leaned her head on his shoulder, and they watched the sun disappear below the horizon, the sky darkening to deep blue and then black, stars beginning to emerge one by one. "Rashid?" "Yes, ask me. Ask you what?" "What you said you'd ask when this was over. Ask me now." He pulled back to look at her, his expression surprised and hopeful. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. I'm ready." Rashid smiled, and it was the most genuine, unguarded smile she'd ever seen on his face. "Layla Hassan, would you have dinner with me? A real date, where we talk about things that have nothing to do with revenge or justice or stolen research, where we just get to know each other as people, without all the weight of the past few weeks." "Yes," Layla said, and she was smiling too, a real smile that reached her eyes for the first time in years. "I would love that. Tomorrow night?" "Tomorrow night." It's a date. They sat on the beach until the stars filled the sky, talking about everything and nothing, about favorite books and childhood memories, about dreams for the future and lessons from the past, about the strange and wonderful way their lives had collided. And when Rashid finally drove her home, when he walked her to her door and kissed her forehead goodnight, Layla felt something she'd thought was lost forever. Hope, real, genuine hope for a future that was finally hers to shape. Marcus Whitmore was exposed. Her name was cleared. Her career was waiting to be reclaimed, and standing beside her, patient and strong and surprisingly gentle, was a man who'd started as her insulter and become her champion. Life was strange, but for the first time in 3 years, it was also good. Layla went inside, changed into comfortable clothes and checked her phone. Already there were messages from the linguist CEO, from a professor at MIT, from a journalist at the New York Times asking for an interview. Her story was getting out. The truth was spreading, and tomorrow, when Stanford's statement went public, the whole world would know what Marcus Whitmore had done. But tonight, Layla just wanted to rest. She climbed into bed, set her alarm, and closed her eyes, and for the first time in 3 years, she slept without nightmares, because the monster was slain, the battle was won, and the future, her future, was just beginning. The next morning, Layla woke to her phone exploding with notifications. Stanford's statement had gone live at 6 a.m. Pacific time, and the internet had erupted. The story was everywhere. Tech news sites, academic journals, major newspapers, social media. Stanford professor exposed for academic fraud. Billionaire Sheikh helps Waitress reclaim stolen research. The woman who fought back and won. Layla scrolled through the headlines with a mixture of vindication and surrealism. This was her life, her story, being discussed by thousands of strangers. Some of the comments were supportive, praising her courage. Others were skeptical, questioning her motives or suggesting she was exaggerating. But the evidence was public now, posted on Stanford's website for anyone to review. The metadata, the timestamps, the testimony. It was all there, irrefutable and damning. Her phone rang. "Rashid, good morning," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Have you seen the news?" "I've seen it. It's everywhere. How are you feeling?" "Overwhelmed, vindicated, terrified, the usual." "That's normal." "Listen, I know you have a lot to process, but I wanted to give you a heads up. You're going to start getting interview requests. A lot of them. My PR team can help you manage them if you want, or you can handle it yourself. Your choice. I don't know what I want, then take your time deciding. You don't have to respond to anyone today, or this week, or ever if you don't want to. This is your story, Layla. You get to decide how and when to tell it. Thank you for everything. You're welcome. Now about tonight. Tonight? Our date, remember? Unless you want to postpone given everything that's happening. Layla thought about it. She could postpone. Could hide in her apartment and avoid the world while the story played out. Or she could do what she'd promised herself. Stop being afraid, stop hiding, and start living again. "No," she said firmly. "I don't want to postpone. I want to have dinner with you and talk about things that have nothing to do with Marcus or Stanford or any of this. That's my girl. I'm still not—" I know. You're not my girl. Yet." She could hear the teasing in his voice. 7 o'clock. "I'll pick you up." "Where are we going?" "It's a surprise. Dress comfortably." "And Layla, yes, I'm proud of you. For everything you've done, everything you've survived, everything you're becoming. I hope you know that." Layla felt tears prick her eyes again, but they were good tears. "Thank you, Rashid. That means more than you know." After they hung up, Layla spent the morning responding to the most important messages. She accepted the interview request from the New York Times. Her story deserved to be told properly, in her own words. She thanked the MIT professor for reaching out and said she'd be interested in discussing opportunities. She sent a polite but firm decline to the tabloid journalists who wanted to focus on her relationship with Rashid rather than the academic fraud. Then she called her father at the hospital. "Mija," he said, his voice weak but warm. "I saw the news. I'm so proud of you." "Thanks, Papa. I wish you could have been there, and I was there in spirit. And I'll be there in person soon. The doctors say I can go home next week." "That's wonderful." The medical bills were still overwhelming, but Rashid had quietly arranged for the best oncologist to review her father's case, and the new treatment plan was showing promise. "I'll make sure everything's ready for you." "Layla, about this Sheikh—" "Papa, don't. I'm just saying be careful. Rich men, they're not always what they seem." "I know, Papa, but Rashid is different. He's good. He helped me when no one else would. Then I look forward to meeting him and thanking him for giving my daughter back her future." After the call, Layla cleaned her apartment, did laundry, and tried to pretend it was a normal day. But every time she checked her phone, there were more messages, more notifications, more evidence that her life had fundamentally changed. By evening, she was exhausted from the emotional roller coaster. But she was also excited about the date, about the chance to just be a woman having dinner with a man she was starting to care about, without all the weight of justice and revenge. She dressed in jeans and a soft blue sweater. Rashid had said comfortable, and she was taking him at his word. She left her hair down, applied minimal makeup, and looked at herself in the mirror. She looked like herself. Not the broken waitress. Not the vindicated victim. Just Layla. It felt good. At exactly 7 o'clock, there was a knock on her door. She opened it to find Rashid in jeans and a casual button-down, looking more relaxed than she'd ever seen him. "You look beautiful," he said. "You look normal," she replied. "It's weird," he laughed. "I do own casual clothes. I just don't wear them often. Where are we going?" "You'll see. Trust me, I'm trying to." "That's all I ask." They drove north, away from the city, into the hills. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant colors, and Layla felt herself relaxing for the first time all day. Finally, they pulled up to a small family-owned Italian restaurant tucked into a hillside, with a patio overlooking the valley below. Layla looked around in surprise. "This is not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Some 5-star restaurant with a Michelin rating and a 6-month waiting list." "I could have done that. But I wanted somewhere real, somewhere we could actually talk without being interrupted every 5 minutes. This place is owned by a family from Naples. The grandmother still makes the pasta by hand every morning." The wine is from their cousin's vineyard in Tuscany. And most importantly, they don't care who I am or how much money I have. They just care about good food and good company. How did you find it? My driver recommended it. He's been coming here for years. They were seated on the patio, at a table with a view of the valley and the lights beginning to twinkle below. The owner, a warm woman named Maria, greeted them like family and promised to bring them the good stuff. And she delivered. Homemade focaccia with olive oil and balsamic, burrata with heirloom tomatoes, pasta carbonara that was so perfect it made Layla close her eyes in appreciation, wine that tasted like sunshine and earth. And through it all they talked, not about Marcus or Stanford or justice, but about everything else. Rashid told her about growing up in Dubai, about his complicated relationship with his father, about the pressure of inheriting an empire at 35, and the loneliness of being surrounded by people who wanted something from you. Layla told him about her childhood in Miami, about her mother who died when she was 15, about learning to cook Lebanese food from memory and smell because she'd never written down the recipes. They talked about books and movies and music, about travel and dreams and fears, about the strange paths that had led them both to that restaurant, to that moment, to each other. "Can I ask you something?" Layla said as they shared a tiramisu for dessert. "Anything. What happens when you go back to Dubai? When this, whatever this is, becomes complicated by distance and different lives?" Rashid set down his fork and looked at her seriously. "Honest answer? Always. I don't know. I have responsibilities in Dubai, business that needs my attention. But I also have the resources to travel, to split my time, to make things work if I want them to work. The question isn't whether it's logistically possible. The question is whether you want to try. I don't know what I want yet. Everything is so new, so overwhelming. Then we take it slow. We see where this goes. I'm not asking you to make any big decisions tonight, Layla. I'm just asking you to keep having dinner with me, to keep talking to me, to keep letting me be part of your life while you figure out what that life is going to look like. And if I decide I want something different, if I want to focus on my career or move somewhere else, then I'll support that. I'm not trying to control your life or your choices. I'm just hoping I get to be part of them, in whatever capacity you're comfortable with." Layla studied his face, looking for deception or manipulation or hidden agendas, but all she saw was sincerity. "You're really not like other men I've known," she said. "I hope that's a good thing." "It is. It's just unfamiliar. I'm used to men who want to take, not men who want to give." "Then let me teach you something new. Let me show you that not everyone is Marcus, that some people actually care about your happiness more than their own benefit. That's a big promise. I'm a man who keeps his promises." They finished dessert and lingered over coffee, neither wanting the evening to end. Finally, as the restaurant began to close, they drove back to Miami, the conversation continuing easily, comfortably. When they reached Layla's apartment, Rashid walked her to her door. "Thank you for tonight," Layla said. "For the dinner, for the conversation, for normalcy. I needed that." "So did I. Can we do it again?" "Yes, I'd like that." They stood there for a moment, the air between them charged with possibility. Rashid reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering on her cheek. "I'm going to kiss you now," he said quietly. "If that's okay." Layla's heart was pounding. "It's okay." He leaned in slowly, giving her time to change her mind, to pull away. But she didn't. She met him halfway, and when their lips touched, it was gentle and sweet and perfect. Not desperate or demanding, just right. When they pulled apart, Layla was smiling. "That was nice," she said, "just nice." "Okay, it was really nice." "Better." He kissed her forehead. "Good night, Layla. Sweet dreams." "Good night, Rashid." She went inside, closed the door, and leaned against it with a smile she couldn't suppress. Her phone buzzed. A text from Rashid. "Already missing you." "Is that pathetic?" She typed back, "Yes, but it's also sweet." Till his response came immediately. "I can live with sweet. See you tomorrow." Tomorrow. Though Layla got ready for bed, her mind replaying the evening, the food, the conversation, the kiss. It had been perfect. Simple and real and exactly what she needed. As she drifted off to sleep, she thought about the future, about the career opportunities waiting for her, about her father coming home from the hospital, about Rashid and whatever this was becoming between them. It was all uncertain, all new, all terrifying, But it was also hers, her choices, her future, her life. And for the first time in 3 years, that felt like enough. More than enough, it felt like everything. The end.